The polished marble floors of the courthouse gleamed, reflecting the tension etched on every face. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters clamored, and a woman named Isabelle Dubois, beautiful and poised, waited for the verdict that would define her future. She was the mistress, the other woman confident that the man she loved, billionaire industrialist Julian Caldwell, would soon be free. But inside, in the hushed courtroom, another woman stood her ground. This was Eleanor Caldwell, the wife a woman scorned, but not broken. What unfolded next wasn't just a divorce proceeding. It was an intricately woven tapestry of deceit, betrayal, and a wife's brilliant, long-game revenge. This is the story of how a woman who seemingly had nothing left to lose walked away with everything, leaving a titan of industry and his mistress with nothing but the bitter taste of their own hubris. The world knew Julian Caldwell as a titan, a man whose name was synonymous with power. His company, Caldwell Industries, had its tendrils in everything from aerospace technology to luxury real estate. His face graced the covers of financial magazines, his opinion sought by world leaders. To the public, he was the epitome of success, a modern-day Midas whose touch turned everything to gold. And on his arm, for 25 years, had been Eleanor. Eleanor Caldwell was the perfect corporate wife. Graceful, intelligent, and impeccably dressed, she was the silent partner in Julian's ascent. She had hosted the dinners, charmed the investors, and raised their 2 children, an heir and a spare, in a sprawling Connecticut estate that felt more like a museum than a home. It was a life of gilded cages and silent sacrifices, a life Eleanor had accepted as the price of admission to Julian's world. The first cracks in their perfect facade appeared not with a bang, but with a whisper, a misplaced phone call, a credit card statement for a boutique Eleanor had never visited, the scent of an unfamiliar, expensive perfume clinging to a suit jacket. They were small things, easily explained away, by a man as skilled in negotiation as Julian. A business dinner that ran late, a gift for a client's wife, a colleague who had gotten too close in a crowded elevator. Eleanor, wanting to believe him, had accepted his explanations. To do otherwise would be to acknowledge the tremor beneath her feet, the one that threatened to bring her carefully constructed world crashing down. The whispers grew louder, taking the form of tabloid headlines and blurry paparazzi photos. Julian laughing with a woman who was decidedly not his wife on a yacht in St. Bart's. Julian his arm around the same woman, leaving a 5-star hotel in Paris. The woman had a name now, Isabelle Dubois. She was a French art gallery owner, 20 years his junior, with wide, innocent eyes and a body that seemed poured into her designer dresses. The public humiliation was a new kind of pain for Eleanor. She had endured Julian's emotional distance for years, his workaholic tendencies that left her feeling like another one of his acquisitions. But this was different. This was a public declaration that she was no longer enough. The society women who had once envied her now pitied her, their sympathetic glances feeling more like daggers. The confrontation, when it finally came, was anticlimactic. It happened in their cavernous living room, surrounded by art they had collected together, monuments to a life that now felt like a lie. Eleanor, holding a glossy magazine with Julian and Isabel on the cover, simply asked, "Who is she?" Julian, ever the pragmatist, didn't bother to lie. "Her name is Isabelle Dubois," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm in love with her." The words hung in the air, heavier than the crystal chandelier above them. Eleanor felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. The years of anxiety, of quiet suspicion, had coalesced into a single, clarifying moment. The tremor was now an earthquake, and the ground was giving way. "I want a divorce," she said, her own voice steady, surprising even herself. Julian, who had expected tears hysterics, perhaps even a plate thrown against the wall, was taken aback. He looked at his wife. Really looked at her for the first time in years. He saw not the wilting flower he had imagined, but a woman of steel. "Fine," he said, a hint of irritation in his voice. "My lawyers will be in touch with yours." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the wreckage of their life. That night, as the rain lashed against the windows of the Connecticut estate, Eleanor did not cry. Instead, she made a phone call. Not to a high-powered divorce attorney. Not yet. She called a man named George Davenport, a retired forensic accountant who had once worked for her father. "George," she said, her voice a low, determined hum. "I have a job for you. I want you to find everything. Every shell corporation, every offshore account, every hidden asset. I want you to dismantle Julian Caldwell's empire, piece by piece." On the other end of the line, George, a man who had spent his life uncovering financial secrets, smiled. "Eleanor," he said, "it would be my pleasure." The game had just begun. While Julian was busy flaunting his new love, Eleanor was quietly assembling her army. She knew that to win this war she needed more than just a good lawyer. She needed a strategist, an investigator, and a secret weapon. The strategist was an easy choice, a formidable take-no-prisoners divorce attorney from New York City named Olivia Vance. Known for her meticulous preparation and her merciless cross-examinations, Olivia had a reputation for leaving her opponents' wallets significantly lighter. The investigator was George Davenport, the forensic accountant, a man whose mild-mannered appearance belied a razor-sharp mind. George had a knack for finding the needles in the financial haystacks of the world's wealthiest men. He operated out of a cluttered office above a bakery in Queens, a world away from the gleaming skyscrapers of Wall Street, but his reach was global. The secret weapon was a woman named Chloe Simmons. Chloe was a former art restorer who now ran a boutique art advisory firm. She was also one of the few people who knew the dark underbelly of the art world, a world of forgeries, inflated appraisals, and secret sales, a world that Julian and Isabel had used to their advantage. Eleanor's first meeting with her team took place in a discreet hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan. The air crackled with a quiet intensity as Eleanor laid out her plan. "Julian thinks this is about his infidelity," she said, her voice firm. "He thinks I'm a scorned wife looking for a generous settlement. He's wrong. This is about 25 years of my life, my contribution to his success, and I intend to be compensated for it." Olivia Vance, a woman with piercing blue eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded in approval. "Julian's initial offer will be insulting," she predicted. "He'll try to hide his assets, claim his business is struggling. It's a classic move." "And that," Eleanor said, a faint smile playing on her lips, "is where George comes in." George, who had been quietly sipping his tea, opened a worn leather briefcase and laid out a series of documents on the table. They were preliminary findings, a breadcrumb trail that he had already started to follow. "Julian is a master of the shell game," he explained. "He has a complex network of offshore corporations, trusts, and limited liability companies designed to obscure his true wealth. But he's not as clever as he thinks he is. He's left a trail." For the next several weeks, George delved deeper into Julian's financial labyrinth. He worked tirelessly, poring over bank records, tax returns, and corporate filings. He followed the money as it flowed from New York to the Cayman Islands, from London to Switzerland, from one anonymous shell corporation to another. It was a painstaking process, but slowly a picture began to emerge. A picture of a man who had systematically and deliberately undervalued his assets, funneling millions of dollars into hidden accounts and investments. Meanwhile, Chloe Simmons was investigating another piece of the puzzle, Isabelle Dubois' art gallery. On the surface, it was a legitimate business specializing in contemporary European art. But Chloe suspected it was more than that. She believed it was a front, a way for Julian to launder money and hide assets in plain sight. Posing as a wealthy art collector, Chloe visited Isabelle's gallery. She was greeted by Isabelle herself, who was every bit as charming and beautiful as the tabloids had described. Isabelle, eager to make a sale, showed Chloe around the gallery, pointing out the works of various up-and-coming artists. Chloe, with her expert eye, noticed several inconsistencies. The prices of some of the paintings seemed wildly inflated. The provenance of others was questionable. She engaged Isabelle in a conversation about the art market, dropping the names of obscure artists and dealers. Isabelle, for all her poise, seemed to have a superficial knowledge of the art world. It was clear that she was not the expert she claimed to be. Chloe's suspicions were confirmed when she discovered that several of the paintings in the gallery had been purchased by a shell corporation that George had linked to Julian. The prices paid for the paintings were a fraction of their current appraised value. It was a classic art fraud scheme. Buy low, inflate the value through a series of sham appraisals and sales, and then use the artwork as collateral for loans or sell it for a massive profit. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Julian wasn't just hiding his money. He was using his mistress's art gallery to do it. The art of deception was not just a metaphor. It was his modus operandi. Back in her hotel suite, Eleanor reviewed the evidence her team had gathered. The offshore accounts, the undervalued assets, the art fraud. It was a mountain of deceit, a testament to Julian's arrogance and his underestimation of her. A wave of cold fury washed over her. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It was financial, a calculated attempt to cheat her out of her rightful share of the empire she had helped build. "He's not just going to pay me what he owes me," she said to Olivia and George, her voice steely with resolve. "He's going to pay for his arrogance. He's going to pay for underestimating me. We're going to take him for everything he's got." The stage was set for a legal battle of epic proportions. Eleanor Caldwell. The quiet, unassuming wife was about to show her husband and the world the true meaning of the phrase, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." As the discovery phase of the divorce proceedings began, Julian Caldwell remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. He was a man accustomed to winning, to bending the world to his will. In his mind, the divorce was a simple transaction, a business deal like any other. He would offer Eleanor a generous settlement, more than generous, he thought, and she would quietly disappear from his life, leaving him free to marry the beautiful and adoring Isabelle. His legal team, a high-priced phalanx of corporate lawyers from a prestigious Wall Street firm, shared his confidence. They saw Eleanor as a typical spurned wife, emotional and irrational, easily placated with a large sum of money. They presented Olivia Vance with an initial offer, a one-time payment of $50 million, plus the Connecticut estate and a small portfolio of stocks. It was a fortune by any normal standard, but it was a pittance compared to Julian's true wealth. Olivia Vance, as predicted, rejected the offer outright. "Mr. Caldwell's offer is an insult to my client," she stated in a letter that dripped with icy disdain. "We will not be intimidated by his attempts to conceal his assets. We are prepared to go to trial, and we are confident that the court will see this for what it is, a blatant attempt to defraud a woman who has dedicated 25 years of her life to his success." Julian was amused by the letter's tone. "She's bluffing," he told his lead attorney, a man named Marcus Thorne. "She has no idea what I'm worth. Give her a little more, dangle another 10 million in front of her. She'll take it." But Eleanor was not bluffing. While Julian's lawyers were busy preparing what they thought would be a simple and straightforward case, Eleanor's team was working in the shadows, meticulously building their case brick by brick. George Davenport had unearthed a complex web of financial deception that even he, a seasoned veteran of forensic accounting, found breathtaking in its audacity. He had traced the flow of money through a dizzying array of offshore accounts in jurisdictions known for their secrecy, the Cayman Islands, Panama, Liechtenstein. He had uncovered shell corporations with names like Pegasus Holdings and Orion Investments, entities that existed only on paper, their sole purpose to hold Julian's hidden wealth. One of his most significant discoveries was a trust that Julian had set up in the Cook Islands, a remote Pacific nation with some of the strongest asset protection laws in the world. The trust, named the Jupiter Trust, held hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, including a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, a collection of rare classic cars, and a private jet. It was a fortress designed to be impenetrable, a financial black hole from which no money could ever be extracted. Or so Julian thought. Meanwhile, Chloe Simmons had continued her investigation into Isabelle Dubois's art gallery. She had cultivated a source, a disgruntled former employee of the gallery, who had been fired for asking too many questions. The ex-employee, a young art history graduate named Sophie, confirmed Chloe's suspicions. She told Chloe that Isabelle knew next to nothing about art, that the real mastermind behind the gallery's operations was Julian himself. Sophie described how Julian would purchase paintings from obscure artists at low prices, then use a network of experts to create a false provenance and inflate their value. The paintings would then be sold to one of Julian's shell corporations at the inflated price, creating a paper trail that made it look like the gallery was a legitimate and profitable business. The artwork itself was then used as collateral for loans, which Julian would then funnel back into his hidden accounts. The most damning piece of evidence that Sophie provided was a set of coded emails between Julian and Isabelle emails that Sophie had secretly copied before she was fired. The emails, disguised as lovers' chatter, were in fact a detailed record of their money laundering scheme. They discussed our little project, the beautiful canvases that keep our secrets, and the new masterpiece that will soon be joining our collection. It was a smoking gun, a clear and undeniable record of their conspiracy. Armed with this mountain of evidence, Olivia Vance prepared for the depositions. The deposition is a crucial part of the discovery process, a chance for the lawyers to question the opposing party and their witnesses under oath. It is a high-stakes game of chess, a battle of wits where a single misstep can have devastating consequences. The first to be deposed was Isabelle Dubois. She arrived at Olivia Vance's office, looking every bit the glamorous art dealer dressed in a chic Chanel suit, her confidence unwavering. But her composure soon began to crumble under Olivia's relentless questioning. Olivia started with the basics, asking Isabelle about her background, her education, her experience in the art world. Isabelle's answers were vague and evasive. When Olivia pressed her for details, for specifics about the artists she represented, the galleries she had worked for, the art fairs she had attended, Isabelle's ignorance became painfully obvious. Then Olivia moved on to the gallery's finances. She presented Isabelle with bank statements, sales records, and appraisal documents, all of which had been provided by George Davenport. She asked Isabel to explain the astronomical prices of some of the paintings, the questionable provenance of others, the series of transactions with offshore corporations. Isabel, who had been coached by Julian's lawyers to plead ignorance, stuck to her script. "I'm not a numbers person," she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I leave the financial side of the business to my accountants." Finally, Olivia produced the coded emails, the ones provided by Sophie. She read them aloud, her voice calm and measured, letting the damning words hang in the air. Isabel's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks, her carefully constructed facade shattering like a dropped vase. She looked at her lawyer, her eyes wide with panic, but he could do nothing to save her. She was trapped, her lies exposed for all to see. The deposition was a disaster for Julian's case. Isabel, the woman he had intended to marry, had been revealed as a key player in his scheme to defraud his wife. The beautiful, adoring art dealer was now a co-conspirator, a liability that threatened to bring his entire house of cards crashing down. When Julian was informed of the deposition's outcome, his amusement turned to cold fury. He had underestimated Eleanor, underestimated her intelligence, her resolve, her ruthlessness. He had thought he was playing a game of checkers, but he was in a game of three-dimensional chess, and he was losing. The gathering storm had finally broken, and Julian Caldwell, the man who had always been in control, was now caught in its eye. The trial was still weeks away, but the first battle had been fought, and Eleanor Caldwell had won. The fallout from Isabel's disastrous deposition sent shockwaves through Julian's camp. His lawyers, who had once been so confident, were now in a state of barely concealed panic. They advised Julian to settle to offer Eleanor a much larger sum of money to make this all go away. But Julian, his pride wounded his arrogance, undiminished, refused. "I will not be blackmailed by my own wife," he seethed. "We will go to trial. We will fight this, and we will win." It was a decision born of hubris, a fatal miscalculation that would ultimately seal his fate. He still believed he could outmaneuver Eleanor, that he could use his wealth and power to crush her. He decided to play his trump card, the one he had been holding in reserve, the one he believed would be his ultimate weapon, their son Julian Caldwell Jr., known to everyone as JC. JC was 24 years old, a recent business school graduate who had just started working for his father's company. He was a golden boy, handsome, charming, and fiercely loyal to his father. He had grown up idolizing Julian, seeing him not just as a father, but as a hero, a giant among men. He had been shielded from the ugliness of his parents' marriage, from his father's infidelities, from his mother's quiet desperation. Julian summoned JC to his office, a vast, imposing space on the top floor of the Caldwell Industries building, with panoramic views of the city. He painted a picture of Eleanor as a vindictive, money-hungry woman, a woman who was trying to destroy him, to destroy the company, to destroy their family's legacy. "Your mother is not the woman you think she is," Julian said, his voice laced with a carefully crafted sense of sorrow and betrayal. "She's being manipulated by her lawyers, greedy sharks who are only interested in a big payday. They've poisoned her mind against me. She's trying to ruin me, JC. And if she ruins me, she ruins you." He told JC that he needed him to testify on his behalf, to tell the court what a wonderful father he had been, what a loving and supportive husband he had always tried to be. He needed JC to paint a picture of Eleanor as a cold, distant mother, a woman who was more interested in her social life than in her own family. JC, who had always seen his father as infallible, was easily swayed. He was hurt and confused by the divorce, and his father's words preyed on his insecurities. He agreed to testify against his own mother, a decision that would have devastating consequences. Eleanor was heartbroken when she learned of JC's decision. Her son, the boy she had raised, the one she had protected from the harsh realities of her marriage, was now siding with the man who had betrayed them both. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any of Julian's infidelities. Her daughter, a fiercely independent young woman named Caroline, who was studying art history in London, was furious. She flew home immediately, confronting her brother in a tearful, angry showdown. "How could you?" she screamed at him. "How could you do this to Mum? After everything she's been through, after everything he's done to her. You don't understand." JC stammered, his usual confidence deserting him. "Dad's not the bad guy here. Mum is the one who's trying to destroy everything." "He's been lying to you, JC," Caroline cried. "He's been lying to us our whole lives. Can't you see that?" But JC, blinded by his loyalty to his father, refused to listen. The battle lines had been drawn, not just in the courtroom, but within the Caldwell family itself. The trial began on a cold, grey morning in November. The courtroom was packed with reporters, society gossips, and a handful of curious onlookers. Isabelle Dubois, a shadow of her former self, was also there, sitting in the back row, her face hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. The first few days of the trial were a blur of legal arguments and witness testimonies. Julian's lawyers did their best to portray him as a victim, a loving husband and father who was being taken to the cleaners by a greedy and vindictive wife. They called a parade of witnesses, friends, business associates, even the family's former housekeeper, all of whom testified to Julian's good character. Then it was JC's turn to take the stand. He looked handsome and confident in his tailored suit, a younger, more vibrant version of his father. He spoke eloquently about his father's generosity, his love for his family, his dedication to his company. He painted a picture of a happy, loving family, a picture that he knew deep down was a lie. Then Olivia Vance began her cross-examination. She was gentle at first, asking JC about his childhood, his relationship with his mother. But then her questions became more pointed, more probing. She asked him about the family vacations where his father was always on the phone. The school events, his father had missed the holidays, his father had spent on business. She then produced a series of emails and text messages. Messages between JC and his mother, messages that painted a very different picture of their relationship. Messages where JC complained to his mother about his father's absence, where he thanked her for her unwavering support, where he told her she was the only one who truly understood him. JC's carefully constructed testimony began to unravel. He stammered, he contradicted himself. He looked to his father for help, but Julian could do nothing but watch his face a mask of cold fury. The final blow came when Olivia Vance produced a copy of a trust document, a trust that Julian had set up for JC and Caroline. The trust was to be funded upon Julian's death, but there was a clause, a cruel and vindictive clause that stated that if Eleanor were to remarry, both JC and Caroline would be disinherited. The courtroom fell silent as Olivia read the clause aloud. JC stared at the document in disbelief, his face ashen. He had never known about this clause. He looked at his father, his eyes pleading for an explanation, but Julian just stared straight ahead. His jaw clenched. In that moment, the scales fell from JC's eyes. He saw his father not as a hero, but as a manipulative, controlling man who would use his own children as pawns in his twisted games. He saw the truth of his mother's words, the truth that his sister had tried to show him. He had been a fool, a blind, trusting fool. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at his mother. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry." The betrayal of a son had backfired. Julian's ultimate weapon had blown up in his face, and in the process had revealed the true depths of his cruelty. The trial was far from over, but the tide had turned, and it was now turning irrevocably in Eleanor's favor. The courtroom was still reeling from JC's emotional breakdown on the witness stand. The image of the golden boy weeping and apologizing to his mother was a powerful one, and it had a profound impact on everyone present, including the judge. Julian Caldwell, the titan of industry. The master of the universe suddenly looked small and pathetic. His legal team was in disarray. Their star witness had not only imploded, but had also provided the prosecution with a bombshell piece of evidence, the vindictive clause in the children's trust. The clause was a clear indication of Julian's malice, his desire to control and punish Eleanor, even after their divorce. The next witness to be called was George Davenport, the mild-mannered forensic accountant who had been Eleanor's secret weapon from the very beginning. He walked to the witness stand with a quiet confidence, carrying a stack of binders filled with financial documents. For the next 2 days, he patiently and methodically walked the court through Julian's complex web of financial deception. He explained in clear and simple terms how Julian had used a network of offshore shell corporations to hide hundreds of millions of dollars. He presented charts and graphs that traced the flow of money from New York to the Cayman Islands, from London to the Cook Islands. He showed the court how Julian had systematically undervalued the assets of Caldwell Industries, siphoning off profits into his hidden accounts. He then turned his attention to the Jupiter Trust, the fortress in the Cook Islands, that Julian believed to be impregnable. George explained that while the Cook Islands' asset protection laws were indeed formidable, they were not insurmountable. He had found a loophole, a tiny crack in the fortress's walls. The trust had been created after Julian had already begun his affair with Isabelle Dubois, and George argued that this constituted a fraudulent conveyance, an attempt to move assets out of the reach of a creditor, in this case Eleanor. Julian's lawyers objected vehemently, but the judge, a shrewd and experienced jurist named Judge Elizabeth Patterson, overruled them. She was intrigued by George's argument, and she allowed him to continue. George then presented the court with his final piece of evidence, the one that would prove to be the nail in Julian's coffin. It was a recorded phone call, a call that Julian had made to his banker in the Cook Islands, just a few weeks before the trial began. The call had been legally obtained through a subpoena, and in it Julian could be heard in his own voice, instructing his banker to move the assets of the Jupiter Trust to a new, even more secretive jurisdiction. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Julian's arrogant, confident voice filled the room. "I don't care what it takes," he said on the recording. "Just make sure that money is gone. I'd rather burn it than give her a single penny." The recording was a bombshell. It was irrefutable proof of Julian's intent to defraud his wife, to hide his assets, to obstruct justice. It was the voice of a man who believed he was above the law, a man who was about to receive a very rude awakening. When the recording was finished, there was a collective gasp from the courtroom. All eyes turned to Julian. He sat frozen in his chair, his face a ghastly shade of white. The Titan had been brought to his knees. The master of deception had been undone by his own words. The rest of the trial was a formality. Julian's lawyers, their case in tatters, could do little more than go through the motions. They tried to discredit George Davenport, to paint him as a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta against Julian. But George's testimony was too well documented, his evidence too overwhelming. Finally, It was Eleanor's turn to take the stand. She walked to the witness box with a quiet dignity, her composure unwavering. She spoke not of Julian's infidelities, not of her own personal pain, but of the 25 years she had dedicated to their marriage, to their family, to the building of his empire. She spoke of the late nights she had spent waiting for him to come home from the office, the business dinners she had hosted, the clients she had charmed. She spoke of the sacrifices she had made, the dreams she had put on hold, the life she had lived in his shadow. Her testimony was not emotional, but it was powerful. It was the story of a woman who had been a true partner, a silent partner in every sense of the word. And it was the story of a woman who was now demanding her due. When she was finished, there was a profound silence in the courtroom. Even Judge Patterson, a woman who had seen it all, seemed moved. She looked at Eleanor with a new respect, a new understanding. She saw not a victim, but a survivor, a woman of strength and resilience. The closing arguments were brief. Olivia Vance, in a masterful summation, laid out the evidence of Julian's massive fraud, his calculated cruelty, his blatant disregard for the law. Julian's lawyer, in a desperate last-ditch effort, tried to portray Eleanor as a woman consumed by greed and revenge. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. The tide had turned. The unraveling of a titan was complete. All that was left was for the judge to render her verdict. The day the verdict was to be delivered, the air in the Manhattan courthouse was so thick with tension, it felt like a physical weight. Every seat was filled. The benches groaned under the collective anticipation of reporters, society gossips who had followed the trial with religious fervor, and law students eager to witness legal history. In the front row, flashbulbs glinted off the stoic faces of Eleanor's team. She sat between Olivia Vance and George Davenport, a portrait of unnerving calm. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but Olivia could see the faint rhythmic tightening of her knuckles. It was the only sign of the tempest raging within. Across the aisle sat the ruins of Julian Caldwell's life. His expensive suit hung on him. His frame diminished. The confident Titan was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out man with haunted eyes. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed erratically in his cheek. His legal team whispered nervously beside him, shuffling papers that were now utterly useless. In the very back row, a ghost in a dark coat, sat Isabelle Dubois. She looked small and anonymous, stripped of her glamour, a spectator at the public execution of the life she had so desperately coveted. A sharp rap of the gavel announced the judge's arrival. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, and the room scraped to its feet. Judge Elizabeth Patterson entered, her black robes flowing behind her. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. She was a woman who understood the gravity of power, and today she wielded it absolutely. Taking her seat, she surveyed the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her, lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Julian. It was a look devoid of pity, a look of pure, unadulterated appraisal. "I have reached a verdict," she began, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the silence. The entire room leaned forward as one. "This has been a long and difficult trial. Divorce proceedings often are. They lay bare the sad and sordid details of a marriage that has tragically broken down. But what has unfolded in this courtroom over the past several weeks is something far more disturbing than a simple marital dissolution. This has been a trial about profound greed, systematic deception, and a shocking, unconscionable abuse of power." Julian flinched as if struck. The color drained from his face. Judge Patterson put on a pair of reading glasses and looked down at the thick document before her. Let us first address the matter of Caldwell Industries and its valuation. The defense has argued that this is a complex global corporation subject to market fluctuations. This is true. However, the evidence presented by Mr. Davenport has shown with meticulous and irrefutable clarity that Mr. Caldwell has engaged in a deliberate campaign to artificially devalue his own company for the purposes of these proceedings. The network of shell corporations from Pegasus Holdings to Orion Investments were not legitimate business entities. They were instruments of fraud designed to siphon hundreds of millions of dollars out of the marital estate. She paused, looking directly at the jury box, now empty, as if addressing the conscience of the community. Then we have the matter of the art gallery, owned and operated by Ms. Isabelle Dubois. In the back, Isabelle shrank further into her coat. This court finds that the gallery was not a legitimate business, but a sophisticated front for money laundering. The coded emails between Mr. Caldwell and Ms. Dubois, discussing beautiful canvases that keep our secrets, were not the flirtations of lovers, but the communications of co-conspirators. The scheme to purchase art at low cost, fraudulently inflate its value, and sell it to Mr. Caldwell's own shell corporations is one of the most brazen attempts to hide assets this court has ever seen. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment. It was vindication, pure and simple. Every suspicion, every quiet fear she had harbored for years was being validated, spoken aloud in this temple of justice. The judge turned a page. But the deceit was not merely financial. It was personal, and it was cruel. I refer now to the Jupiter Trust, established in the Cook Islands, and more specifically to the clause concerning the children of this marriage, Julian Caldwell Jr. and Caroline Caldwell. She peered over her glasses at Julian. To include a provision that would disinherit your own children should their mother choose to remarry is not just controlling. It is an act of breathtaking malice. It is a testament to a man so consumed by his own ego that he would use his children as weapons in a campaign of personal vengeance. It is frankly morally reprehensible. At his mother's side, J.C. squeezed her hand, tears welling in his eyes. It was the final public confirmation of the truth he had so painfully come to accept. Therefore, Judge Patterson continued, her voice hardening, this court must now render a judgment that not only compensates Ms. Caldwell for her 25 years as a partner in this marriage and this enterprise, but also punishes Mr. Caldwell for his egregious conduct. She began with the undisputed assets, the Connecticut estate, the Park Avenue apartment, the stock portfolio, the fleet of cars. All awarded to the plaintiff, Ms. Eleanor Caldwell. A low murmur went through the room. It was a clean sweep, but it was just the appetizer. Now, the judge said, her voice dropping slightly, creating a dramatic hush, we turn to the concealed assets, the funds held in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Liechtenstein, the assets held by the network of shell corporations, the full fraudulently appraised value of the art collection, and the entire content of the Jupiter Trust, which this court deems a fraudulent conveyance. After careful review of the forensic accounting provided by Mr. Davenport, this court values these hidden marital assets at approximately $1.2 billion. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Julian's face was now a ghastly shade of white. He looked like he was going to be sick. Given the scale of the fraud perpetrated by the defendant, Judge Patterson declared, her voice ringing with authority, and his attempts to deceive this court and defraud his wife, it is my judgment that these assets be divided as follows. She paused, letting the moment hang in the air, a sword suspended by a single thread. 30% to the defendant, Mr. Julian Caldwell. The room held its breath. And 70% to the plaintiff, Miss Eleanor Caldwell. Pandemonium. The word exploded through the courtroom. A reporter in the back yelped. The sound of a dozen laptops clicking at once filled the air. 70%. It wasn't just a victory. It was an annihilation. A punishment of biblical proportions. Julian slumped in his chair as if his spine had dissolved. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he was staring into Sun, seeing the abyss that had just opened up beneath him. But Judge Patterson wasn't finished. She held up a hand for silence. Furthermore, she said, her eyes fixed on Julian, Mr. Caldwell will be responsible for the entirety of Ms. Caldwell's legal and forensic accounting fees. And given the defendant's blatant attempts to obstruct justice and commit perjury before this court, I am left with no alternative. She looked towards the federal prosecutor, who had been observing the trial from the front row. This court is hereby referring this entire matter, including all evidence and testimony, to the Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York for immediate criminal investigation. It was the final devastating blow. A kill shot. Julian Caldwell was no longer just a ruined divorcee. He was a future felon. His lawyer's jaw dropped. The financial devastation was one thing. The prospect of prison was another entirely. Court is adjourned, Judge Patterson said, banging the gavel with a sharp, final crack that echoed the shattering of an empire. As she swept from the room, the courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled over benches, shouting questions. Eleanor, her face wet with tears of relief and vindication, fell into the arms of Olivia Vance, who was beaming. George Davenport patted her on the back, a rare, wide smile on his face. J.C. wrapped his arms around all of them, a family reborn in the crucible of the trial. As Eleanor and her team made their way through the mob, she glanced back one last time. Julian was still sitting at the defendant's table, utterly alone. His lawyers were already packing their briefcases, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of their client. He looked small, pathetic a king, without a kingdom, a man who had everything, and in his bottomless greed had lost it all. The mistress had waited outside for a victory, but the wife had just walked out with justice. In the aftermath of the verdict, the world that had once revolved around Julian Caldwell didn't just wobble. It flew off its axis and disintegrated into a million nits. The headlines were savage, a public crucifixion for a man who had once been worshipped at the altar of capitalism. "Titan taken down," blared the New York Post. "From penthouse to prison, Caldwell's empire crumbles," reported the Wall Street Journal. The man who had once been a king, whose every pronouncement moved markets, was now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, a symbol of hubris and its inevitable spectacular fall. The U.S. Attorney's Office handed a case on a silver platter by Eleanor's team, moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned even seasoned legal observers. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, the offshore accounts, the fraudulent art appraisals, and the damning recording of his own voice, Julian was cornered. His high-priced lawyers, now dealing with a federal indictment, advised him that his only option to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison was to cooperate. The arrogance finally shattered. In a hushed federal courtroom stripped of his custom-tailored suits and looking frail in a standard-issue jumpsuit, Julian Caldwell pleaded guilty to conspiracy wire fraud and tax evasion. The judge, unmoved by his lawyer's pleas for leniency, sentenced him to 10 years in a medium-security federal prison. The fall from grace was absolute. The man who once flew on a private jet now shuffled in leg irons. His new home was not a sprawling estate, but an 8 by 10-foot cell his new associates, not CEOs and senators, but convicted criminals. In the first few months he tried to wield his old power to bribe guards and manipulate inmates, but his currency was worthless here. He was just a number, a ghost of a man, haunted by the echoes of a life he had arrogantly thrown away. Caldwell Industries. The colossus he had built could not survive the taint of its founder. The stock plummeted into junk status overnight. Investors, terrified of further scandal, pulled out in a mass exodus. The board of directors, in a desperate act of self-preservation, purged his name from the letterhead and forced his resignation. The company was carved up like a carcass, its divisions sold off to competitors for pennies on the dollar. It was a sad, ignominious end to a once great empire, dismantled as thoroughly as George Davenport had dismantled its financial statements. Isabelle Dubois, the beautiful and ambitious Mistress, became a pariah. Facing her own indictment, she agreed to testify against Julian in exchange for a lighter sentence. Her story, a mix of greed, naivete, and willful blindness, painted a pathetic picture. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. The Chanel suits were replaced with an orange vest she wore while cleaning graffiti off subway walls. Her art gallery was seized, its collection of fraudulent masterpieces auctioned off by the government. She disappeared from public view, a footnote in the epic downfall she had helped precipitate, her name forever linked to the scandal that had destroyed them all. And what of Eleanor? She had walked out of that courtroom with a fortune so vast it was almost abstract. But more than the money, she had walked out with her freedom, a concept she was only just beginning to understand. The first few weeks were disorienting. For 25 years her life had been dictated by Julian's schedule, his needs, his ambitions. Now there was only silence. The first act of her new life was to sell the Connecticut estate. The sprawling mansion with its cold marble floors and ghost-filled rooms felt like a mausoleum. She let the auction house take everything: the furniture, the art they had collected, the monuments to a life that had been a lie. She kept nothing but her personal belongings and a few photographs of her children when they were young and innocent. With the proceeds, she purchased a magnificent brownstone in Greenwich Village, a neighborhood pulsating with art life and authenticity. It was the opposite of her old life in every way. Instead of manicured lawns, she had a small wild garden. Instead of a formal dining room, she had a large open kitchen that was always filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and baking bread. Her daughter Caroline, who had been her fierce defender, became her partner. With Caroline's expertise in art history and Eleanor's newfound business acumen, they established the Eleanor Caldwell Foundation. Its mission was simple but revolutionary: to find and fund the brilliant women who were being overlooked and underestimated by a world still dominated by men. They poured millions into scholarships for female artists, grants for women-owned tech startups, and seed money for female entrepreneurs. The foundation wasn't just a charity. It was an engine of change, fueled by the very fortune a man had tried to hide from a woman. One of their first projects was to save a struggling gallery in Brooklyn that showcased the work of immigrant women artists. The gallery was about to close its doors when the foundation swept in, not just with a check, but with a team of mentors and business advisors. Eleanor stood at the gallery's reopening, surrounded by vibrant, powerful art, and felt a sense of purpose that 1,000 society galas had never given her. Her relationship with JC, her son, underwent a profound healing. The trial had been a brutal awakening for him, shattering the idol he had worshipped. Riddled with guilt, he left the corporate world he had been groomed for and went back to school, earning a master's degree in social work. He now worked at a community center in the Bronx, dedicating his life to helping at-risk teenagers. He and Eleanor would meet for lunch every week, their conversations filled with a new honesty and mutual respect. The bond once broken by betrayal was now forged in the fires of truth and forgiveness. One grey afternoon, a letter arrived at the brownstone. The postmark was from a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. It was from Julian. The letter was a rambling, self-pitying tirade, blaming her, the judge, his lawyers, everyone but himself for his downfall. He ended by begging for money for a fraction of the fortune she now controlled. The Eleanor of old might have felt a pang of pity, a flicker of residual obligation, but the woman she was now simply folded the letter and slid it into the fireplace. As she watched the paper curl and blacken, turning to ash, she felt the last final chain to her old life break. He no longer had any power over her. Eleanor Caldwell. The woman once known only as the billionaire's wife had risen from the ashes of her marriage, not as a vengeful fury, but as a creator, a builder, a force for good. She had taken the pain and transformed it, the stolen money, and sanctified it. She was often seen walking the streets of her neighborhood, a quiet smile on her face, no longer defined by the man she had married, but by the woman she had become. The world had watched a mistress wait outside a courtroom, expecting to see a wife destroyed. Instead, they had witnessed the birth of a queen. The 70% of the fortune was just the seed money. Her real empire, built on integrity, purpose, and an unbreakable spirit, was just beginning. The story of Eleanor Caldwell is a powerful reminder that the scales of justice, though they may grind slowly, do eventually balance. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet, unyielding strength of a woman who refused to be a victim. Eleanor's journey from a silent partner in a gilded cage to the architect of her own destiny is a masterclass in strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve. She proved that the greatest power isn't in wealth or status, but in knowing your own worth and having the courage to fight for it. If this story of betrayal, brilliant revenge, and ultimate triumph resonated with you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with others who appreciate a story where the underdog, armed with intelligence and integrity, comes out on top. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that are more captivating than fiction. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.